Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Mr. Night Shadow's Bedtime Horror Stories. The aim of this series is to create a peaceful atmosphere around you, where horror meets relaxation for a better night's sleep. If you're enjoying my nightly stories, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on my next episode. I love knowing where my listeners drift off to sleep from. Do well to leave a comment below telling me your location. Now, dim the lights, put on your headphones, and let's begin. I had just started my first real nursing job, the kind of job where you work long, lonely shifts, mostly through the night. It was at this small old hospital in a town so quiet that you could hear every sound, especially on nights like this, with the rain tapping against the window, soft but steady, like a reminder that everyone else was asleep, safe in their beds. I wasn't alone exactly. There was Janine, the senior nurse on the floor. She was sharp, with a dry sense of humor and the kind of face that seemed like it had seen everything. Janine always stayed back near the nurse's station, sipping her coffee and knitting, but even with her around, the place felt empty. The other nurses would warn me sometimes, mostly as jokes, but their faces would get a little serious when they mentioned the night visitor. It's one of those stories they tell all the new hires. A story they're half joking about, but still give you that look when they tell it. Supposedly, once in a while, a visitor would appear in the hall around 3 a.m., just standing there. No one knew who or what it was, but everyone had their theories. The thing was, I'd been at the hospital for a few weeks now, and I hadn't seen anything. So I brushed it off as just another one of those spooky tales. Now, on this one particular night, I was caring for Mr. Halloway, an elderly man who'd been here for a couple of weeks. He was one of those quiet patients, didn't ask for much. He'd talk sometimes, mostly to himself, about his wife who'd passed years ago. He'd say things like, "She'll be back soon, just waiting for her." It was heartbreaking. And on nights when it rained, he'd get unsettled. It was about 2:45 a.m., and I was checking his vitals when he suddenly grabbed my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone his age, and his eyes, those tired, watery eyes, looked straight into mine. "She's coming tonight, isn't she?" he whispered, his voice soft but full of something I can't describe. I didn't know what to say. I tried to reassure him, gently told him it was probably just his mind playing tricks. But he shook his head, let go of my hand, and looked toward the door. I remember he just stared. The rain had picked up, and as I went about my rounds, I felt that strange heaviness that everyone always talks about. Maybe it was my mind getting the better of me. Hospitals at night do that to you. It's like the quiet becomes too loud, if that makes any sense. I was updating charts at the nurse's station, and out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone standing at the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light. It was just a shadowy shape, barely moving. Thinking it was Janine or maybe one of the orderlies, I didn't think too much of it. But then I realized Janine was right behind me, mumbling to herself about a knitting pattern. I hadn't heard the elevator ding or any footsteps approaching. I looked back down the hall and the figure was still there, still as stone. The next thing I remember, Janine spoke up from behind me, her voice low and calm. "Did you see him?" I froze. "See? Who?" She gave me this knowing look, one that said she wasn't surprised, but wasn't exactly comfortable either. You'll see him sometimes. Don't make a fuss. He doesn't like to be noticed. My skin prickled. I didn't know what to think. But something about the way Janine said it, like it was a fact of life, like the rain or the dark, made me take it seriously. I tried to ignore the figure, went back to my rounds, checking on Mr. Halloway again. He was dozing, but as I turned to leave, I heard him mumbling in his sleep. "She's here. She's here." It took everything in me not to look back down the hall, but the curiosity was stronger than the fear. When I did glance back, the figure was gone. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. Just past 3 a.m., like clockwork, there it would be. This shadowy figure always in the same spot. Sometimes it looked taller, sometimes smaller. I could never make out a face or any details, just a vague human-like form. But each time it got a little closer to Mr. Halloway's room. Janine finally told me a bit more. She said years ago there was a patient, a man who'd been waiting for his wife to arrive before he died. She never came. Some people said he'd been left behind, and sometimes he'd still wander the halls, waiting. One night, Mr. Halloway was particularly restless. I stayed with him longer than usual, talking to him about anything and everything, hoping it would calm him down. He started mumbling again about seeing his wife, how she was just outside, waiting. Then I saw the figure again, right outside Mr. Halloway's door. My chest tightened. The figure stood there, perfectly still, almost expectant. Mr. Halloway looked at me, his face soft, almost at peace, and he whispered, "It's time, isn't it?" I didn't know what to say. I just held his hand, a bit tighter than usual, and nodded. After that night, Mr. Halloway passed, peacefully, in his sleep. And the strange thing, I never saw that figure again. Not in that hallway. Not in any part of the hospital. Janine didn't say anything, but she gave me a small nod the next morning. Like she knew. Maybe she did. You know how some places just seem to hold memories? Like they're almost alive with them? That's how I feel about this lake. I still remember every detail. The way the water always looked a little too dark, a little too still, like it was waiting for something, or maybe someone. It was a place people didn't visit much anymore, not since a few accidents happened years back. Folks said it was cursed, but I never believed in all that, until that summer. It was supposed to be a weekend away, a small break from the city. I was meeting up with some old friends from college, and we thought it'd be fun to camp by the lake. We'd done it before, back in our college days when everything seemed less complicated. Less, well, heavy. So, there was me, Sean, my best friend from back then, who always had this way of finding trouble, and Mia, a quiet, gentle soul who'd been like the glue that kept us all together. She was the one who actually convinced us to head back to the lake, said we could relive old times, even though it had been years. I could tell she missed those days, and honestly, so did I. When we got there, things started off like any camping trip would. We set up our tents, joked around, shared stories. But as the sun dipped lower, casting a dull orange glow over the water, I felt off. Maybe it was just nerves from being back in a place we hadn't seen in years. Or maybe it was the quiet. Nature's silence can feel loud sometimes, like it's trying to tell you something. As night fell, we sat by the fire, letting the crackling fill the silence. That's when Sean, who'd had a bit too much to drink, started telling stories about the Watcher. I'd forgotten about that old legend, But Sean remembered every word. He talked about how back in the 90s there were a few drownings in the lake, all of them under strange circumstances. People had claimed to see a figure, someone watching them from the shore. They'd called him the Watcher by the Lake. Mia laughed it off, saying it was just a ghost story meant to scare kids. But I noticed her eyes drifting to the water, the way she'd quickly look away, almost like she didn't want to stare too long. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed by the fire, feeling oddly restless. I thought I'd heard something, a soft rustling, like footsteps on the damp ground. I brushed it off, figuring it was just some animal. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned toward the lake, and for just a split second, I thought I saw a shadow near the water's edge. It was just standing there, unmoving, like it was waiting. I shook my head, tried to laugh it off. Maybe I'd let Sean's stories get to me. Still, that night I didn't sleep too well. The next day, Mia and I took a walk along the shore. She seemed distant, distracted even. And after a while, she told me something that stuck with me. Back in college, when we used to camp here, she'd wake up some nights and see someone standing by the lake. She'd never told anyone because she thought it was just a dream, a trick of the moonlight. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just nerves or her mind playing tricks. But deep down, I wondered if she'd seen the same thing I thought I'd seen. She gave me this strange look, one that made me feel like maybe she knew more than she was letting on. As the sun set again, casting that same eerie glow across the water, Sean suggested we take one last swim before nightfall. I hesitated, but Mia surprisingly agreed. So we all waded into the water, laughing and splashing around like we were kids again. But even in the middle of the lake, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was watching us from just below the surface. That's when I noticed Mia's expression change. Her laughter faded, her face going pale. She was looking past me toward the shore. I followed her gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw the shadow again. A tall figure just standing there, staring at us from the water's edge. I called out to Sean, but he just shrugged, said he didn't see anything. I wanted to believe him, but Mia's face told a different story. Later that night, as the rain started to fall, we all crawled into our tents. But around 3 a.m., I heard that same rustling outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not rushed, just steady, moving closer and closer. I lay there, barely breathing, my heart pounding, convinced it was some animal. But then I heard Mia's voice whispering from her tent, "Do you see it?" I froze, dared to peek outside my tent. There, by the edge of the lake, was the figure, only this time it was closer. I could almost make out a face, but it was hazy, like it didn't quite belong to the world. It looked lonely, sad, almost. But it was watching us, no doubt about it. When morning came, Mia insisted we leave, and honestly, I couldn't argue. We packed up in silence, and as we drove away, I glanced back one last time. The lake looked calm, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there, watching. We didn't talk much after that trip. Not about the lake, not about the Watcher. Mia and I would text here and there, but I could tell it had changed something in her. Even Sean seemed quieter, like he was still trying to figure out what he believed. Sometimes you end up at places you never planned to visit. That's how I feel about my aunt's farm. I never had a reason to go there, really. My Aunt Jenny, she was nice and all, but we weren't close. She was that kind of relative you see once every few years at family gatherings, the one who sits in the corner and doesn't say much. But when she called asking if I could help her out for a weekend, I couldn't exactly say no. The farm was tucked in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods that seemed like they went on forever. Aunt Jenny had lived there alone for years after my uncle passed, and there was something about the place, this weight in the air, like it had a memory of its own. I got there just before dusk, and the first thing she told me was, "Whatever you do, don't go into the barn at night." At first, I thought she was joking. Why would anyone go in there at night anyway? It was this big old sagging thing with peeling paint, looking like it'd topple over if you so much as sneezed near it. But she wasn't laughing. Aunt Jenny's face went pale and she looked dead serious. She even grabbed my arm, her hand cold and trembling. "Promise me you won't," she whispered. "All right, Aunt Jenny. I promise," I said, trying to laugh it off. But something in her eyes stayed with me. It was a kind of fear I hadn't seen before. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. The wind didn't move. Not a single bird or cricket made a sound. It was like nature had decided to hold its breath. Around midnight, I heard something strange, this low, groaning sound, like old wood bending under weight. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably the barn settling. But as the night dragged on, it kept coming back. This slow, dragging sound that almost sounded alive. The next morning, I asked Aunt Jenny about it, but she just shook her head, saying, "You're better off not asking questions." Then, without another word, she handed me a list of chores that kept me busy all day. By the second night, curiosity was getting the better of me. I mean, I was a grown adult. What could be in that barn that was so terrible? So, after Aunt Jenny had gone to bed, I decided I'd take a quick look. I'd just peek through the gaps in the barn doors, enough to see what was inside. Just enough to put my mind at ease. As I walked out into the yard, everything felt different, colder somehow. When I reached the barn, I noticed something strange. The doors were slightly open, just a crack, as if they were waiting for me. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open wider. The air inside was thick, heavy with this strange smell, something between damp earth and old wood. It wasn't exactly a comforting smell, but it wasn't awful either. Just odd. I shone my flashlight around, and at first I didn't see anything unusual. Just old tools, some hay bales stacked against the walls, and an old, dust-covered mirror leaning against a wooden post. Suddenly, I heard a sound. That same dragging, groaning sound from the night before. Only this time, it was louder, coming from somewhere near the back of the barn. I took a few steps forward, and the sound stopped. The silence hit me like a wall. I turned to leave, but then I heard something else, a faint whisper. It was so soft I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clear as day. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, saying, "Don't go." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Just then I saw movement in the corner of my eye. There, near the back of the barn, was an old dusty tarp, and it was shifting, like something was underneath it. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt glued to the spot. Slowly the tarp moved, as if whatever was beneath it was trying to push its way out. Finally, I managed to take a step back, but as I did, something caught my eye. On the wall, etched in a shaky, rough handwriting, were the words, We are still here. Over and over, scratched into the wood, as if someone had written it again and again, trying to make sure no one would forget. I backed out of the barn, closing the doors behind me as quietly as I could. But the moment I turned to walk away, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see Aunt Jenny or someone playing a cruel joke. But there was no one there. I ran back to the house, locked the door, and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I packed my bags, ready to leave, but Aunt Jenny stopped me. She looked at me with this hollow expression and she said, "It's better you don't come back here." She told me about her late husband, my uncle. He'd gone into that barn one night years ago, and he'd never been the same. Sometimes, she said, places remember things. They keep memories, and sometimes they keep people. I left that day and didn't look back. But every now and then I think about Aunt Jenny, all alone on that old farm, with only the barn and its whispers for company. I don't know what I heard that night or if it was even real, but I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and whenever I hear that low groan, even in the wind or the creak of old wood, I remember that voice whispering, "Don't go." It still haunts me. I don't think it'll ever stop. When I moved into that old farmhouse with Lily, my daughter, I thought I was starting fresh. Just the two of us. A quieter place for us both after a year that had been, well, let's just say, more than difficult. Lily was only 5 and already asking me questions I didn't have answers to. So, when I found the rental listing for this farmhouse on the edge of a small town, it felt like a sign. It was early November when we moved in, and that first night there was a heavy rainstorm. You know, the kind where it just keeps coming down, without stopping, blanketing everything. The house was oddly silent, but the rain on the roof was comforting, at least at first. A few nights in, after I'd tucked Lily in and settled down with a book, I heard something that didn't quite fit. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, right above Lily's room. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon or some animal had climbed up there, but the steps were too slow, too calculated, like someone pacing. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was nothing, but I checked outside just to be sure. Nothing. Just rain and darkness, the fields stretching out as far as I could see. The next night, though, it happened again. Same time, same careful, deliberate steps on the roof above Lily's room. Each time, I found myself listening more closely, holding my breath, waiting. Then Lily started mentioning things, odd things. One morning over breakfast, she told me about her friends in the rain. I asked her what she meant, and she just shrugged, saying, "They come to the window when it rains. They're quiet, but they're there." I brushed it off at first, thinking it was her imagination. But when she started drawing them, shadowy figures with long arms and dark eyes, I couldn't shake this feeling that there was something more to it, something I wasn't seeing. A week later, I mentioned it to Joe, an older guy who lived nearby. He'd been around long enough to know the area's quirks. I told him about the footsteps, how they seemed to follow a pattern, moving with this strange purpose. He listened, his face growing paler with each word. When I was done, he told me, "You're not the first to hear them." According to him, there were old stories, rumors, that the land had always been unsettled. He said it in a way that made me feel like the word meant something heavier, more serious than I wanted to think. Some spirits, he warned me, they don't mean harm, but they want to be known. Don't go messing with whatever's out there, Ray. I laughed it off, mostly because I didn't want to admit how much it rattled me. But the next night when I heard the footsteps again, I couldn't laugh. The footsteps, they'd moved. Now they were inside, in the hallways. Each step was slow, heavy, like whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. And it wasn't just me hearing them anymore. Lily woke up once, asking if her friends were coming to visit. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that I was as scared as she was? Each night I'd find myself standing in the hallway listening. Sometimes the footsteps would stop just behind me, but when I'd turn, there was nothing there. Just shadows stretching out across the old wooden floors, empty, but somehow watching. I wasn't sleeping. Lily's drawings of the shadowy figures on her walls grew more detailed, more unsettling. And those footsteps, they never missed a night. It was like they were part of the house itself, like the walls and floorboards were alive with something old and patient, waiting for I don't even know what. Then one night I couldn't take it anymore. Standing there in the hallway, I just spoke out loud, not even sure if anyone or anything would hear me. I said, "I know you're here. I don't know what you want, but I know you're here." I didn't know what I expected. Maybe for the footsteps to stop. Maybe for something to happen. And they did stop. Just like that. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain outside, like the house was holding its breath. Lily slept soundly that night, for the first time in days. And when I checked on her in the morning, the drawings of her friends were gone, wiped clean, as if they'd never been there. We stayed in that house through the rest of November, and I never heard the footsteps again. But even now, whenever it rains, there's this feeling I can't shake, like something's still listening. I don't tell Lily about it, no point in scaring her, but every time the clouds roll in, I think about those nights. I wonder if whoever was there is still out there. There's something about being lost that plays tricks on your mind, especially when you don't realize it's happening. Last November, me and a few friends, just looking for something fun to do, decided to take on a maze. Not just any maze, though. This was the kind of place people whispered about in town, the kind they said you couldn't just finish. It's only open for 1 week each year, but people claimed it messed with you. They didn't need to say more. We were hooked. There were 4 of us. Me, my friend Emily, and the couple, Jason and Maria. It's always Jason's idea to get into these things, and honestly, if he hadn't suggested it, I'd probably have been sitting at home, finishing my semester project. But he had a way of convincing us that something like this would be the most fun we'd have all year. So, there we were, standing at the entrance as the sun started to dip below the horizon. A few locals hung around, but they didn't seem as excited. One of them, an older woman with a wrinkled face and a worn-out jacket, came up to us as we were about to enter. She looked each of us over and said, "Be careful in there. Once you go in, sometimes it feels like you're walking in circles, no matter how hard you try to get out." We laughed it off, but I won't forget the way her eyes lingered on us as we stepped in. The maze started out as a fun challenge, just what you'd expect. Rows of corn taller than us on either side, twisting paths that seemed simple enough at first. We joked, laughed, took wrong turns and didn't mind, because we figured we'd make it to the end eventually. But after what felt like an hour, the mood shifted. I don't know if it was because the sun had completely set, or because the air just felt thicker. Jason and Maria had gone on ahead, their laughter echoing as they disappeared around a corner. Emily and I stuck together, talking about nothing in particular, just keeping each other company. But as we kept going, I started to notice something strange. Certain parts of the maze felt familiar, too familiar. A broken cornstalk here, a patch of dirt that had a weird shape. It was like we'd been there already, several times. I stopped to tell Emily, and she looked around, her brow furrowed. "You're right, Alex," she whispered. "But maybe it's just a trick of the mind." Before we knew it, Jason and Maria's voices had faded. We tried calling for them, but only got a muffled response that seemed to come from somewhere deeper inside. I felt a cold sweat building as I realized we might actually be lost. Emily kept saying she could hear Jason's voice. She pointed one way, convinced that he was just around the next turn. But every time we followed her directions, the sound seemed to drift further, almost like Jason's voice was leading us somewhere. We'd yell back only to hear his voice respond, but wrong. It sounded almost stretched, like it was coming from an old recording. I kept trying to check the time on my phone, but the screen was glitching, flickering in and out. My watch was useless, frozen at 8:13. But what really unnerved me was the quiet. For a while it felt like we were the only ones left, wandering endlessly in the dark. That's when I found it. Stuck in the dirt near a corner of the path, half covered in mud and brittle, was a torn piece of paper. I crouched down, picked it up and read the shaky handwriting. "I hear voices, but they're lying. Don't follow them." Emily's face went pale when she saw it. I wanted to laugh it off, pretend it was just a leftover Halloween prank. But the way her eyes locked onto mine, I knew she felt it too. This wasn't just a corn maze anymore. It was something twisted, something alive. We kept moving, trying to stick to what we thought was the main path, but it felt like every direction led us back to the same place, the same patch of familiar corn. Emily started to get frantic, saying she could still hear Jason, but by then I knew better than to trust any voice in that maze. Finally, as a last-ditch effort, I pulled out my lighter. I'd never thought I'd be the kind of person to set something on fire, but in that moment I didn't care. I just wanted out. I lit a dry cornstalk on the edge of the path, hoping it'd create enough smoke for someone, anyone, to find us. The flames crackled up fast, lighting up the maze around us, casting long shadows that twisted and danced in ways that didn't feel right. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, watching us from between the stalks. And then, nothing. The next thing I remember is waking up outside the maze, sprawled out on the ground with Emily beside me, both of us covered in dirt and shivering. I looked around, dazed, trying to get my bearings. That older woman who had warned us earlier was standing there, along with a few others, watching us with these concerned, almost pitying looks. One of the men helped me up and said, "You kids have been gone for over a day." I looked at him, shaking my head, because to me it felt like we'd been in there for just an hour or two at most. But the more he talked, the clearer it became that we'd lost an entire day wandering in that maze. And Jason and Maria, they never came out. I tried to ask if anyone had seen them, if they'd come out after us, but the locals just exchanged glances, muttering things I couldn't quite catch. Nobody had seen them. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. When you go through a major change in life, sometimes you just want a fresh start. I'd just signed the divorce papers a few weeks prior, and I was feeling raw, a little hollow if I'm honest. That's when I found the apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, slightly run-down place on the edge of town. Creaky floors, one small window overlooking the street below, and that damp smell that never really goes away. Moving in was quiet. My neighbors barely glanced at me even when I passed them in the hallways. They kept to themselves, and I figured it was just one of those buildings where everyone was wrapped up in their own worlds. The first night it rained, hard, the kind of rain that makes everything feel like it's wrapped in a gray fog. I unpacked slowly, trying to fill the silence. Every so often, I'd hear the floor creak in the apartment above, or a faint whisper of conversation from the hallway. But mostly, it was just me, alone. It was around midnight, I think, when I saw it for the first time. I was brushing my teeth, standing in front of that single window, which looked out over the empty street. There wasn't much to see, just rain-soaked pavement and the occasional flicker of streetlight. But in the corner of my eye, I noticed something odd. In the window, I saw what looked like a dark, shadowy shape just barely behind me. I froze, toothbrush still in my hand, my heart suddenly pounding. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see someone. Maybe one of those quiet neighbors playing a prank or just standing there. But there was nothing. Just my empty apartment, dimly lit by a single table lamp. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light or the rain outside. But when I turned back to the window, the shadow was still there, only this time it seemed closer, clearer. After that night, the figure became a fixture. Every evening, as soon as the sun went down, it would appear in the window, just in my reflection. Sometimes it seemed distant, a blurry silhouette, barely visible. Other times, it looked like it was only inches away, just behind my shoulder. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as stress or a leftover feeling from everything I'd been through. But every time I looked, it was there, watching. I tried to confide in one of my neighbors, a quiet woman named Mrs. Loring who lived down the hall. I don't know why I chose her. Maybe it was her eyes. They looked like they'd seen a lot. I stopped her one afternoon, asked if she'd ever seen anything strange in the building. She just stared at me for a long moment, her face expressionless. Then, almost as if talking to herself, she muttered, "My daughter used to see things too, in the windows." That was all she said before she turned and walked away, her footsteps soft and slow. I stood there, feeling more alone than ever. Whatever I'd hoped to gain from that conversation, it only left me with more questions. As the nights went on, I tried everything to ignore it. But the figure became clearer, its shape more defined. It was a person, or at least it had been. A face started to emerge, a pale, thin face with sunken eyes that stared out from the reflection, hollow and unblinking. I'd turn, desperate to catch it, to prove that it was just a trick of the light, but there was nothing. Only an empty room and my own shallow breaths. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to confront whatever this was. I turned on every light in the apartment, flooding the room with brightness, and stood in front of the window, staring at that reflection, daring it to do something, anything. The face stared back at me, clearer than it had ever been, pale with dark sunken eyes, its mouth slightly open, almost like it was whispering. And then I heard it, soft, almost too faint to make out, a whisper, coming from behind me. But I was alone. My heart was racing, my skin cold with fear. I was sure I'd lost it, that I was imagining the whole thing. But the whispering grew louder, a murmur of words I couldn't quite make out. And the figure, it looked like it was getting closer, leaning in from behind me, its eyes locked onto mine through the reflection. That was it. I snapped. I grabbed a bookend from the shelf beside me and hurled it at the window, shattering the glass in a burst of noise. The reflection vanished, gone in an instant, leaving me staring at the rain-soaked street outside, breathless and trembling. For a moment, I felt relief, like I'd finally broken whatever spell had been haunting me. But then the lights flickered, and I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, passing right by my door. The landlord came by the next day, frowning as he looked over the broken window. He didn't ask what happened, didn't even seem surprised. He just muttered something about getting it fixed, though he never looked me in the eyes. The window was replaced, good as new. But till date, that experience still haunts me. At night, in those quiet moments when I catch my reflection, I see something else, just behind me, watching. There's something about long road trips at night that can mess with your head. The endless dark roads, the hum of the engine, and that creeping exhaustion. It all starts to blend together after a while. I'd been driving for hours when the rain started, coming down hard and fast. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. So, when I spotted a little inn up the road, its lights flickering through the rain, I didn't think twice. I pulled in, glad for a chance to get off the road. The place looked old, quaint, I guess you could say. It had a cozy, homey feel to it, but something about it just felt a bit still, like the air was heavy, if that makes any sense. Inside, a fire was crackling in the lobby, and the innkeeper, a thin older woman with silver-streaked hair, was waiting behind the counter, her smile a little too fixed. She welcomed me with this practiced warmth, handing me an old-fashioned brass key. "You're the only guest here tonight," she said before glancing at something behind me. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Well, except for one other." I felt a strange chill, though I brushed it off as the cold rain still clinging to my clothes. I took the key, trying to shake off the odd feeling, and made my way up the creaky wooden staircase to my room. Later that night, I went out to the hallway for some water from the vending machine. The lights flickered slightly as I walked, casting odd shadows against the faded wallpaper. I was almost to the machine when I saw him, the other guest. He stood a few feet away, hunched and still, with dark circles under his eyes and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in ages. He didn't say anything, didn't even acknowledge me, just stared at something down the hall as if lost in thought. There was this strange pull, like I should follow him. I felt my feet almost moving on their own, and I shook myself back to my senses, turning quickly back toward my room. As I closed the door behind me, I tried to shake off that feeling, convincing myself he was just some guy down on his luck, maybe a traveler who'd been on the road too long, like me. Lying in bed, I could still hear faint voices from the hallway, like someone was talking just outside my door. They sounded muffled, like they were coming from far away, though I couldn't make out the words. I told myself it was probably the other guest, pacing or talking to himself. But as the hours crept on, I started feeling a prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I tried to sleep, but every little creak and sound kept me on edge. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard a light tapping at my door, followed by a whispered voice, barely audible through the thick wood. "You should leave before dawn," it said, the voice strained and weak. My heart raced as I lay frozen, barely breathing, listening to the silence settle back in after the voice faded away. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, just staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. At dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag and went downstairs, determined to get out of there. I found the innkeeper at the counter, her expression calm, as if she'd been expecting me. "I'd like to check out," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, her eyes unreadable, and said, "You were the only guest here last night. No one else checked in." I stared at her, my mind racing. "But I saw someone," I insisted, "in the hallway. He spoke to me. He told me to leave before dawn." The innkeeper's face didn't change, but there was something in her eyes. A flicker of recognition, maybe even pity. "No one else has stayed here in years," she said quietly, almost like she was talking to herself. "Except, well, some say they've seen a man, but he's been gone for a long time." I glanced around, my heart pounding, and that's when I noticed the old wooden rocking chair by the window. It was empty, just slightly swaying, as if someone had been sitting there only moments before. Without another word, I turned and practically ran out of that place, not stopping until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anyone was watching me from the window. So, that's a wrap for tonight's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're still awake, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments if this story helped you fall asleep. And feel free to share it with friends. I'd be happy if you did. For now, to help you drift off, I'm going to leave the rain sounds playing for a few more minutes before ending this video. Until next time, this is Mr. Night Shadows.